In order to maintain freedom of religion, the Psychological Practices Act had to include that last bit about priests and ministers. And that was the loophole Scientology used to get around this law. They lobbied the Labor Party hard and got the agreement of certain labor officials to recognize the Church of Scientology as a religious denomination under the Marriage Act. This allowed them to not only perform weddings, but basically took Scientology out from under the purview of the Psychological Practices Act. This effectively canceled the entire structure of the laws enacted to control Scientology in Australia and nullified the Anderson Report. Such is the way of true believers who feel they're on the path of righteousness. Scientology imbues its members with a sense of purpose, and Hubbard himself actually tells them in his lectures and writings that they are in a war against the forces of ignorance, darkness, and slavery. I think we all know that there's nothing that unites a group of people stronger than giving them a common enemy, which they believe they must destroy in order for the world to continue to survive. For Scientologists, that enemy is anyone who dares to speak out against or tries to stop Scientology. Following this victory, Scientology then wanted religious recognition across the nation so as to avoid payroll taxes. Here's what Posamai says. In Victoria in 1983, the church faced a legal battle on the issue of being defined as a religion for tax purposes in the Church of the New Faith versus Commissioner for Payroll Taxes. The court was asked to decide if the church was a religious institution for the purpose of tax exemption. The church was first listed as a foreign company, as the Church of the New Faith Incorporated in 1969 in Victoria. When the Church of the New Faith was asked to pay taxes from 1975 to 77, it objected on the basis that it was a religion, and thus claiming its wages were not liable to payroll tax. After many rejections to this objection, the corporation/church applied for an appeal at the High Court of Australia. The court investigated whether this corporation was, during the relevant period, a religious institution. Instead of focusing on the writings of Hubbard as previously done, the court focused instead on whether the beliefs, practices, and observances which were established by the affidavits and oral evidence as the set of beliefs, practices, and observances accepted by Scientologists are properly to be described as a religion. The court held that beliefs, practices, and observances of this church did constitute a religion in the state of Victoria. Now, this is all true, but is a little misleading. In 1983, the Victorian Supreme Court actually ruled against Scientology on this matter of being a religion and not having to pay taxes. Here is what the full court's findings said. Introduction of a service, ceremonies, and other external indicia of a religion is no more than a cynical desire to present Scientology as what it is not, for such mundane purposes as acquiring the protection of constitutional guarantees of freedom of religion or obtaining exemption from the burden of taxing laws. The creed and services described in a 1959 booklet called Ceremonies of the Founding Church of Scientology, which had been published in America, played absolutely no part in the teaching or practice of Scientology until the late 1960s. These so-called ceremonies were devised and published as a device to enable, with such attendant advantages as would thereby accrue, Scientology to be paraded as a church in the United States, and should properly be described as a masquerade and a charade. So, the Victorian Supreme Court saw right through Scientology's charade, and they rejected it. However, Scientology took it all the way to the High Court of Australia, and this is where Scientology got their way. But it was a pretty bitter victory for Scientology, because here is what Justices Mason and Brennan said. Charlatanism is a necessary price of religious freedom. And if a self-proclaimed teacher persuades others to believe in a religion which he propounds, lack of sincerity or integrity on his part is not incompatible with the religious character of the beliefs, practices, and observances accepted by his followers. The Australian High Court basically saw right through Hubbard's shenanigans, but in their opinion, their hands were tied. Why? Because of this. The question to which the evidence was directed was not whether the beliefs, practices, and observances of the persons in ultimate command of the organization constituted a religion, but whether those of the general group of adherents constituted a religion. The question which the parties resolved to litigate must be taken to be whether the beliefs, practices, and observances which the general group of adherents accept is a religion. You see, it doesn't matter if the leader is a con man. If the people he is conning believe his con, then guess what? It's legit in the eyes of the law. And if you stop and think about it for a second, you'll see why in any free society, this is the hard choice, but ultimately is the right one from the point of view of the law. If any government or legal body begins to regulate what you can or cannot believe, what you do or don't have the right to think, then we're all doomed. Because down that road lies the ultimate in tyranny and a level of authoritarian control that engulfs everyone in the nation. It's not that the judges were bought off, don't get it, or don't see what's going on. It's that ultimately, when a bunch of people fall for a con, that con might as well be legit, and they get the support of the legal system in acquiring the rights and privileges they do not actually deserve. It's the trade-off for having free speech, free thought, and the power of choice to believe whatever you want. Governments are faced with this problem all the time. It is not their prerogative to decide whether a belief system is valid or not. It's not on them to say whether the Westboro Baptists are making a good point, or whether Jim Jones' followers actually believed what he had to say. The government is not passing judgment on the legitimacy of a religion when they grant it religious status. They're simply acknowledging that a group of people have come together and share a common belief system, and thereby are afforded certain rights and privileges under the law. In the case of Scientology, when any group of people profess to follow the beliefs and practices that L. Ron Hubbard teaches, that is their right under law. And they then give over their rights to protection under the law for things which any non-Scientologist wouldn't tolerate for even a second. It's a sad but true statement that the freedom to practice a religion includes that religious group's right to abuse its members. So long as the people who are being abused consent to it, the law's hands are tied. And so we come down to one of the most basic, core issues of not just Scientology, but all destructive cults. That it is incumbent upon us, the common people, to be educated and to be informed enough to not let ourselves be conned in the first place. To not allow anyone to take away our rights and freedoms by falling for their platitudes, their thought-stopping cliches, and their holier-than-thou assertions which tell us how great we are and how awful everyone else is. How our group has the only road to salvation, and everyone else is doomed to an eternity of pain and suffering because they don't believe what we believe. They don't act as we act. When any religious leader is telling you such things, they're creating an us versus them mentality in your mind and setting you up to dislike, ridicule, or even hate people you don't even know. If you ever find yourself in a position where people are telling you things like that, you need to run, not walk away from it as fast as possible, because your own rights, your own freedoms are in danger in such groups. That is why we call them destructive cults, and there are a lot more of them than just Scientology. Now, I'm not going to cover the rest of this chapter, which basically consists of Posame lambasting Australian media for not being supportive and respectful towards Scientology as a religious movement. Given the horrible experiences of former members and people who literally had to physically escape from Scientology's clutches in order to tell their stories, there's little reason for the Australian media to write puff pieces about Scientology. If Possum Eye is curious why Scientology's good works aren't being publicized by the media, perhaps they should look more closely at what good works Scientology is actually engaged in. They'll find there's precious little for the media to report on, because the only thing the Church of Scientology really cares about is how much income they're making each week. When you factor in the history and facts I've included in this video, you see that Adam and Althea Possum Eye's attempts to paint Scientology in a positive light fail miserably. They have to ignore all the facts related to this group, as does every academic in this book so far, in order to come away thinking that Scientology brings anything new, different, or positive to the world. That it exists at all is a sad but necessary testament to free societies around the world, who accept that with freedom of speech, thought, and religion come con men like L. Ron Hubbard, who will take advantage of those freedoms for self-aggrandizement and personal wealth and power. It's on us to make sure that doesn't happen by educating ourselves and speaking out against their abuses so they don't wrangle in new members. Unfortunately, some academics who should be helping in that education effort are working against it.